If I speak in tongues of human beings and of angels, but I don't have love, I'm a clanging gong or a clashing cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and I know all the mysteries and everything else, and if I have such complete faith that I can move mountains, but I don't have love, I'm nothing. If I give away everything that I have and hand over my own body to feel good about what I've done, but I don't have love, I receive no benefit whatsoever. Love is patient. Love is kind. It isn't jealous. It doesn't brag. It isn't arrogant. It isn't rude. It doesn't seek its own advantage. It isn't irritable. It doesn't keep a record of complaints. It isn't happy with injustice, but it is happy with the truth. Love puts up with all things, trusts all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. Love never fails. As for prophecies, they will be brought to an end. As for tongues, they will stop. As for knowledge, it will be brought to an end. We know in part and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, what is partial will be brought to an end. When I was a child, I used to speak like a child, reason like a child, and think like a child. But now that I have become a man, I have put an end to childish things. Now we see a reflection in a mirror, then we will see face to face. Now I know partially, but then I will know completely in the same way that I have been completely known. Now faith, hope, and love remain, these three things. And the greatest of these is love. This is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God.
My name is Christopher Vaughn. I'm the youth minister here at Grace Avenue, and I don't often have the privilege to be here with you during the 11 o'clock service. I'm often upstairs teaching Sunday school to our junior and senior high students, and so it's a privilege to be here with you this morning. A moment of privilege, if you will. I know that there are those who are watching from the live stream, including my mother, who had the flu and couldn't be here, so hi, Mom. I'm going to do something a little differently this morning than I normally do. Normally, I'm a manuscript preacher, which means I stand here at this podium, who has never let me down, and I read the words that I have written for you. I am far more eloquent on paper than I am in person. But today I'm going to step away from the podium, and so if I seem a little nervous, it's because I am. The last couple of weeks here at Grace Avenue, we've been covering the topic of service. We've looked at 1 Corinthians 12. We've talked about what it means to be one body, committed to Christ in single purpose of service. Today we read the scriptures from 1 Corinthians 13, and we began talking about what it means to truly love, what love looks like when love doesn't fail. And it reminds me of a few weeks ago when I was putting my son Benjamin to sleep. Benjamin is 3 years old, and I don't know how many of you may have a 3-year-old at home or had a 3-year-old at home at one point, but if there's one thing that 3-year-olds don't like to do, it's sleep. And so I'm getting him ready for bed, and I hold him in my arms, and I give him his goodnight kiss, and I set him down, and I say, buddy, I love you. Good night. And he looks up at me and he says, but Daddy, I don't love you. And I said, okay, well, if you get scared tonight or you need anything, don't call me. And I felt pretty good about it. The next night, my wife is getting Benjamin ready for bed. She gives him his goodnight kisses and she says, oh, sweet boy, I love you. And I wait, because I know what's coming. And he looks up at her and he says, well, Mommy, I don't love you. And she looks at him and she says, that's okay. Mommy loves you anyway. No matter what you say or what you do, Mommy will always love you. And I said, oh. That's how I was supposed to respond. And I failed. And so this morning we're going to talk about how human love fails us, but God's love never does. And as we dig into that this morning, will you pray with me? Lord, let the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Love never fails. And yet, when I say it out loud like that, most of you collectively begin thinking about a time when love failed you. You begin thinking about divorce, broken relationships, friendships, someone who bullied you that you thought you could trust, a boss who you looked up to who disappointed you. I look out at the world and I see neighbors fighting neighbors, children shooting up schools, a nation torn apart by ideology. Our life experience has taught us that love fails all the time. I think the issue is that we wrap ourselves in our humanity and it fails us. We wrap ourselves in individuality, lust and pride, selfishness, greed, gluttony, envy, anger, all of those things that make up sin. And then we fail one another because we get so caught up in the me that we forget about the we. That list in 1 Corinthians 13, that list of what love is, that's Paul's effort to try and get the community of Corinth to come together. It's a list of things that isn't supposed to be done alone, but in community. It was a reminder of what is needed for people to come together for God. We are supposed to live out that list as a church hand in hand with God. And we have a God who showed us the way to live into these verses. A God who sent his Son to give us an example of how we are to treat one another. And so we know that when we wrap ourselves in God's divinity, it strengthens us. It reminds us how to love one another. But we're afraid. We remember that when Jesus came off the cross and out of the tomb, he said to us, Look at this now. Here is how I want you to live. I want you to take up my cross and live in the spirit of that which I taught, a spirit of unconditional love, unwavering forgiveness, amazing grace, unflinching commitment, sacrificial service. And we're afraid that if we take up that cross, if we wrap ourselves in the divinity of Jesus, that it may send us to places that we might never expect, to help people in a way that we may never truly know. We like to talk about the cross and sing about the cross, but when it comes to actually living it out, we are more comfortable wrapped in our humanity than in God's divinity. And every time we do that, love fails. It is only in truly taking up the cross and truly wrapping ourselves in our identity in the divinity of God that love never fails. This morning, I'm going to tell you the stories of 3 different people, some of whose lives were touched by someone wrapped up in divinity and some who are wrapped up themselves. In all of their stories, I think you will see that love that is wrapped up in God, never fails. In 1996 in Denver, Colorado, there was a 16-year-old boy named Aaron Stark. Aaron was almost a school shooter. Aaron had a really tough upbringing. He had abusive parents. They were drug addicts and alcoholics, and he didn't grow up in the best home. Aaron estimates that before the age of 16, he went to maybe 30 or 40 schools. He lost count. His parents were always getting crashed in on in the middle of the night by the police, talking their way out of things and then moving across country to avoid jurisdiction. And so Aaron was the perpetual new kid. He didn't have the same parental love and guidance that most of us did. And so he didn't shower very often. His clothes were always dirty because there was no one to wash them or show him how to do it. There were holes in it. And a smelly, holy student does not make new friends easily. Aaron also had a weight problem, and the bullies at school would often come up to him and move their hands like harpoons and shoot him like a whale, or dump food on his head. And so Aaron would say from an early age he began to wrap himself in darkness. There was comfort there. He would also tell you that he learned there were good people in the world and bad people in the world, and he decided that he must just be one of the bad people. And so he began to live into that. At age 14, he began to cut. At age 16, he was homeless, kicked out of his house by his parents. And at one of the lowest points in his life, he's in the backyard of one of his friends living in their shed. He's sitting in a tattered chair, cobwebs on it, staring at a hole in the ceiling with the rain coming down and blood dripping down his arm as he tried to kill himself. And his friend came and he saved him. And later, as they were talking, Aaron said, I've got to do something or I really am going to kill myself. And so he called social services. Unfortunately for Aaron, Aaron's a minor. And so when he went into social services, they also brought in his mother, one of the primary sources of abuse in his life. And Aaron's mother, the perpetual runaway, knew exactly what to say to police and social workers. She said, oh, it's just a cry for help. He just wants attention. He's making all these stories up. Just send us home with him. We'll take care of him. And as they were heading out of the social services office, she looked at him and she said, do a better job next time, and I'll buy the razor blades. And Aaron would tell you at that point, he felt like his heart was ripped out of his chest. And that darkness which he had wrapped in, he began to run towards, and he was angry, and he was frustrated, and he decided that he was going to commit an act of violence. He knew that he was either going to shoot up his school or a mall. He didn't care about the people. He cared about being able to do the most damage in the shortest amount of time with the least amount of security. But he needed a gun first. And so he walked up to some gangbangers at his school, and into that shed walked his best friend. The best friend who he long ago thought he had pushed away because he had lied to him, stolen from him, damaged his property. That friend walked into his life anyway. And Aaron would tell you it was a shining light in the darkness. That Tuesday was the day that Aaron had decided that he was going to commit his act of violence. And his friend walked into his life, and he sat down, and he said, he offered me just a simple act of kindness. It wasn't the kind of overbearing kindness that you see from a lot of people. He didn't walk in and say, hey, I know you're struggling. Let me take you somewhere to get some help. Let's find some way to get you some services. I just want to help you. No, his friend walked in, and he said, hey, you want to get some lunch? You want to go to a movie? And he treated it like just any normal Tuesday. And Aaron would say, in that small act of kindness, for one of the first times in his life, someone treated him like a person when he didn't even feel human. At the end of this story, Aaron says this: he stopped me that day with his kindness. If you see someone that's in that dark spot that needs love, give it to them. Love the ones you feel deserve it the least because they need it the most. It'll help you just as much as it helps them. Instead of rejecting, show a simple act of kindness. Show people that they're worth it. You see, Aaron's whole life, he was failed by people so wrapped up in their own humanity that they never really noticed him. His parents failed to love him. His teachers failed to notice him. His peers bullied him. Social workers failed to hear him. All of these people wrapped in their own humanity failed to show Aaron what he needed: love, acceptance, kindness, patience, gentleness. All of the things from the scriptures we read today. but one friend, wrapped in divinity, wrapped in the love of God, was able to share with Aaron what he had been searching for his whole life. And it changed his whole world. All it takes is a small act of kindness. All it takes is recognizing the call to wrap ourselves in our faith and step into the world ready to do the work of God. Sometimes love is just a simple act of kindness. Sometimes it's about creating unexpected relationships. That's what Daryl Davis does. 30 years ago, Daryl Davis was playing the blues in the Silver Dollar Lounge. Afterwards, he was approached by an elderly white man who said, "I've never heard a black man play the blues before." To which Daryl replied, "Really? Because we invented it." Which surprised the man, and as they sat down and began to talk about music, some other things came out. The older man said, "Well, I've also never had any kind of meal with a black man before either." And Daryl was confused by that. He said, "I'm 25 years old. I think I've had meals with thousands of white men. How is this man who's 15, 20 years older than me, how has he never had a meal with a black man before?" And he asked him. And his friend who's sitting next to him begins to nudge him and says, just tell him. The old man says, "Well, I'm a member of the Ku Klux Klan." And Daryl kind of laughed. He thought he was joking until the man pulled out his membership card and set it on the table. And Daryl said, "Maybe I should have been nervous or afraid, but music had already brought us together." So we continued in conversation, and I planted a seed, and I began to nourish it. And the man said, "If you ever play again, I want to hear you. Give me a call." And that sparked Daryl's next 30 years of what I would call ministry. And he decided to go around the country, and he would sit down with Klan leaders and Klan members to find out one simple question: how can you hate me when you don't even know me? And Daryl would say the best thing to do if you're going to go in a conversation with somebody who believes differently than you do is to study up on the subject as much as you can. And he said, "I went in armed, not with weapons, but with knowledge. I knew as much about the Klan, if not more, than any of the Klan people that I talked to. When they see that you know their organization, their belief system, they respect you. Whether they like you or not, they respect the fact that you've done your homework. And just like any good salesman, you want a return visit. And they recognize that I'd done my homework, which allowed me to come back again." Which began to chip away at their ideology. You see, when two enemies are talking, they are not fighting. It's when the talking ceases that the ground becomes fertile for violence. If you spend 5 minutes with your worst enemy, and Daryl would tell you it doesn't have to be talking about race, it could be about anything, you will find that you both have something in common. As you build upon those commonalities, you're forming a relationship, and you build that relationship into a friendship. And that's what would happen. Daryl would tell you, "I didn't convert anybody. They saw the light and converted themselves." Once the men have decided to leave the Klan, Daryl has a simple ritual and request. He asks them for their Klan robes. And so far to this date, he's collected over 200. All because he was wrapped in God's divinity. He refused to let love fail to racism and hate. He formed relationships with those who hated him and found commonalities with them, building and forming friendship, and he didn't expect them to change, but those that encountered him were inevitably changed by him. When we live a life for Christ, wrapped in the divinity of God, love never fails. See, love is in seeing who someone can be, not necessarily who they are now. And further, sometimes it takes a community to restore our faith in ourselves. Father Gregory Joseph Boyle is an American Roman Catholic priest of the Jesuit order. He's the founder and director of Homeboy Industries. If you don't know anything about Homeboy Industries, it's an organization based out of Los Angeles, and they focus on rehabilitating gang members and formerly incarcerated men and women. Father Boyle has hundreds of clips on YouTube, all of which I enjoy, but one has been making the rounds again the last few weeks on Facebook, and it's one of my favorites. Father Boyle is speaking to a group of graduate students, and he's telling them about a time when he was invited to give a lecture in front of about 1,000 people. And they said to Father Boyle, when you come, would you bring some of your gang members with you? Would you bring some of your homies with you? And he said, yeah, I'll bring a couple of them with me. And Father Boyle knows most of the homies in the context of Homeboy Industries. They have a bakery. They do a couple of other things in the community. They provide jobs when otherwise it's hard to get jobs. And so he sees them in that context. He decided to take one gang member with him named Mario. Mario, in the history of Homeboy Industries, is probably the most tattooed individual to ever work there. He has tattoo sleeves. His hands are tattooed. His head is shaved and covered in tattoos. His neck is black with the name of his gang. His face is covered in tattoos, and on his eyelids are written the words, "The End," so that when he's in his coffin, you know for sure he's done. And Father Boyle took him with him on this journey to the conference. And it struck him because it was the first time he'd ever seen him out of Homeboy Industries. And as they're walking through the airport, mothers are picking up their children. People are switching sides of the terminal that they're walking through because he looks scary. And they're afraid. And Father Boyle said this struck me, this contrast, because of who I know Mario to be. If on Monday morning you were to walk into Homeboy Industries and ask them who the kindest, gentlest soul that works there is, they wouldn't say Father Boyle. They would say Mario. And it's true that the soul that ventilates gentleness and kindness is the only soul that has the ability to change the world. And so that evening, as they are preparing to speak, Father Boyle invites Mario forward to tell his story, and he's nervous. He's never talked in front of any crowd of people before, let alone 1,000. And he begins to tell his story. And Father Boyle said if his story was a fire, you would have to step back or you would get burned. And he shared a beautiful testimony of his life. And at the end, Father Boyle does a Q&A. And a woman raises her hand. He says, yes, ma'am. She stands up. She said, my first question is for Mario, right off the bat. And she says, Mario, you said that you're a father and that you have a son and a daughter who are about to be in their teenage years. What advice do you give them? What wisdom do you impart to them? And Mario is standing in front of her. He's tall, skinny, and his hands are shaking. He's so nervous. And he can't quite get his words out. He says, and he begins to break down and he begins to walk away. He's just too nervous to talk, but you can tell he just really wants to get a sentence out, and he steps back up and he says, I just don't want my kids to end up like me. And he begins to break down in tears. And the woman stands back up and goes to the microphone, and she's got tears in her eyes, and she says, why wouldn't you want your kids to end up like you? You are kind, and you are gentle, and you are loving, and I hope your kids end up like you. And Mario buries his face in his hands because he's completely overwhelmed with emotion. Because in that moment, he has encountered the never-ending, unfailing love of God. This room full of people, these strangers, stand up and begin applauding. They returned himself to him. You see, human love and human relationships, they've failed all of us. Each of us has a story of a broken relationship, a broken friendship, someone who betrayed us or bullied us. A story where humanity has failed us, and yet when humanity wraps itself in divinity, then love never fails. When humanity wraps itself in divinity, then love never fails. I hope you've heard these stories here today and you begun to think of a time in your life when someone wrapped in divinity helped shape your life into what it is now, who you've become now. A mother, a father, a grandparent, a relative, a friend, a church member, a stranger on the street. All of us, I pray, have special people who have loved us into being who we are today. People who were wrapped in divinity. People who changed our lives, whether they knew it or not, just by being there. A small act of kindness, an unexpected friendship, a community that lifted us up when we didn't expect it. And now each of us have the same opportunity to wrap ourselves in divinity, to love like God loves us, and in doing so, to bring God's ultimate purpose to all of humanity, which is to show them that love wrapped up in God never fails. Amen.